lots of time to kill, waiting here for you. I've had good a job in Louisville.
What makes a smart city, and what role does city government have in fostering its development? I'm Chad Vanderveen, editor of FutureStructure, and on this edition of FutureStructure Radio, I'm speaking with Ted Smith, Chief Civic Innovation Officer for the city of Louisville, Kentucky. Smart cities start with soft infrastructure, the policy, legal, and regulatory framework that makes the technologically sophisticated hard infrastructure possible. Ted and Louisville Mayor Greg Fischer have been gaining national attention for their efforts in laying the foundation for Louisville to grow into one of the country's smartest cities. Well, maybe a good place to start is, what's sort of top of mind for you guys? I know you're working on a lot of innovative things there, but what stands out to you as most important?
Yeah, so, I think on the sort of the, think of it as like the longer horizon, we're working to, I think, make the most of all of this sort of Internet of Things stuff, right? And in practical terms, it's sensors, and in super practical terms, it's sensors that are owned and operated by a wide constellation of characters. And so, kind of if the last version of American city infrastructure was, here are the things that the city owns, and here are the things that the regulated utility owns, and that's what we call infrastructure. I think we're starting to see emerge a new picture that's not really anything like that. Where, I face this just real practically around residential gigabit internet. And you'd say, gosh, why is Ted Smith spending time in the mayor's office on, trying to attract private companies into our market to do this work? It's because it's a form of infrastructure that is not captured in that old model, right? But in some cities it is, they've turned it into public utility work. But lots of cities, it's not a public utility. It's the private marketplace sort of sorting itself out. And, of course, those Google cities are very much that. It's infrastructure. It's competitive infrastructure. It matters greatly. Don't get me wrong. Like in our economic development front, it matters greatly how we answer the question about our telecommunications fabric for entrepreneurs, for very small businesses. If you play that out, if my challenge today is around how we make sure we can compete with other U.S. and foreign cities on telecommunications infrastructure, what else will we be competing on that isn't within the scope and purview of our municipal government or public utilities? And it turns out, I think there's a whole lot of things. And, I think a progressive, forward-leaning government sort of innovation organization is focused on how do I embrace and welcome and integrate all this other information that, the vendors would have called smarter cities or whatever, but really it's actually just civilization, right? It's right. The tools that people expect. It's the stuff that's happening. It's not a marketing piece of marketing collateral, and it's not an enterprise software suite. It's actually a whole lot of stuff that's new and that needs to be rationalized in the current context of what's a city.
So how do you use that idea of a smart city and the infrastructure associated with it to, as you said, attract the private companies to come there?
Well, so what we've been up to, and I encourage you to do a lot of aggressive Googling of my name in Gigabit in Louisville, you'll see that we've gone through a journey of, following the gig.u playbook, and I think Blair Levin is a genius. So they put a set of, kind of a playbook, a set of guidelines for how cities can be most attractive to the private sector for making these kinds of investments, and to be a fiber-friendly city. And Google picked up a lot of this. So, all the guidelines that GigU developed, Google immediately put into their, this is the checklist you need to, produce for us if you want to be considered. They're the usual suspects. It's what's your regulatory environment like? Is it, cumbersome, or is it ready for this kind of activity? Do you have any infrastructure that can be sort of co-opted to move more quickly and cost effectively? So do you have empty conduit? Do you have your pole attachment rights rationalized? Do you have all that? Do you understand your role as an anchor tenant on a network? So how much money do we spend as a city for telecommunications, and how much of that could be made available to somebody who wants to come in and run a network that serves some other social mission for us? So you got to do that work, and so we put an RFI out looking for who would even contemplate moving into our market. And we had, 6 or 7 responses to the RFI about a year ago, sort of this time last year. And then we worked with them, interviewed them, and, had to change our franchise ordinances. The terms were too short to be attractive. We had to change our bonding requirements because, our bonding insurance requirements were appropriate if you were going to put a sewer in the ground. It's, hundreds of millions of dollars of insurance. To microtrench a fiber, you don't need a $100 million insurance policy. So those kinds of changes we made legislatively, and then we put an RFP out on the street and said, hey, we're not going to buy anything, but we're interested, or not an RFP, I'm sorry, we put the telecommunications franchise award out on the street and said, if you would like to apply for in a non-competitive, but through a bidding process, a franchise to provide these services, we're in the business of expediting approvals for people that want to come in and provide this kind of service. And we had 3 vendors apply for franchise, 2 of them explicitly to put in residential gigabit, and so they were awarded their franchises a couple of months ago, and now they're going through, sort of the diligence that the private sector has to go through to figure this stuff out. But it's it's the next best thing to getting in the business, and that's the way the mayor and I think about this.
So we hear this term a lot. Obviously, we do here at FutureStructure. This idea of smart cities, and we go to a lot of places around the country, conferences and whatnot, and invariably someone will ask. You're in a panel or whatever it is. Someone will ask the panelists, how do you define a smart city, or what makes a smart city? And in your perspective from Louisville, what defines what a smart city is for you guys?
Yeah, so I've got a real sort of pedestrian answer for that, which is, a smart city is one who has moved from, relatively static and slow-moving data about the operation and function of the city to much more of a real-time, fluid, dynamic understanding of the city. And so, if you look at the vast majority of sort of city stat kinds of programs, dashboards for cities,
right.
You look at the underlying data. We have a very aggressive dashboard program here called Louisville. And, when you look at the underlying data, it is slow-moving, slowly accumulating data that, is, and maybe appropriately so for some of the kinds of questions that it answers, but, it's the same data that cities have had for decades, And so when I compare that to what the private sector is used to looking at, I like to pick on Google traffic as my favorite thing to pick on. So, every year, every city in America lays a cable across a road, and for 5 days in October does a traffic count, pays $200,000 to a vendor, and then says, "This is what the traffic is on this road." Until we lay a strip down again, that's what the number is. Okay, based on those 5 days in October.
Right.
Okay, so Google knows every day of the week what the traffic is, and so and for $25,000 you can have an enterprise license to Google traffic. And so why are we spending $200,000 for immediately stale information like every city in the United States of America does every day of the week? Why do we do this? And so a smart city would be one that says, hey, Google, we're probably never going to make the investment you've made in, Bluetooth sniffing and, whatever, all kind of other cell phone sniffing, whatever they do. We're probably never going to make that investment. We're probably never going to do that. But since you've done it, maybe we should figure out how to work with you. And I really think that there's 100,000 examples that are exactly like that. I'm doing some very, I think, interesting work in air monitoring right now. And the EPA, recognizes that there are low-cost air monitors on the market, and there are more coming every day thanks to the open hardware movement. It's pretty important, I think, that we are the kind of public sector that recognizes that there are new technologies for sensing air. And if individuals and groups want to go buy those technologies and measure data, I think we need to understand it, welcome it, look at it, show them ours, all that kind of stuff. And so, I have a very aggressive project around air mapping right now where, we've mostly built an open data portal for the community so that we can bring all these data sources together so that we're not caught in a situation where, my watch, the small particulate matter was too high. What are you going to do about it, Mayor? And I'm like, hey, how about you plug your watch into our data platform, which is hosted over at the Community Foundation. And by the way, the EPA monitor data is right in there too, because that's all open data. And so we're really trying to change the conversation. So a smarter city is one that is working with real-time data, with a kind of finesse, right? We get it, totally understand that the data can be generated anytime, all the time, and it can change all the time. Smart cities are working with real-time data and are trying to manage their community and their city in more real-time terms. So that's my crude definition.
We get the question a lot. What's the role of the city itself in fostering the development of a smarter city?
So I think it's an open innovation job. I spent a brief tour of duty in the federal government, when the president signed his open government executive order, and I watched kind of the philosophy of government at the federal level sort of slowly change, right, from we've got the smartest scientists, we've got all this stuff, look at our stuff, to, okay, we'll have a hackathon, you got something that you think can help solve this great challenge in our country, we're open to ideas, and, the first time it didn't sound true, and it probably wasn't, but the 10th time, it was like, hey, somebody in Chicago did something kind of interesting, and so I absolutely believe in open innovation, and I believe that the public sector plays a critically important role in signaling that kind of innovation is welcome and will be acted on.
So, and that kind of gets back to a question I wanted to ask you a little bit ago, and because you were talking about you were referring to the Google traffic. I guess the question is, why do some cities not, or most cities, I guess is really the case, why do they not do that? What's holding them back?
Well, I think some of it is because it is a change. It's a change in the narrative, right? So the public sector. You really have to think about these. I've spent enough time on this problem. So there's the nonprofit sector, there's the public sector, and there's the private sector. And when people choose to work in these places or lead in these places, they really are leading in a different part of the economy from the other two sectors. And they've got a different set of rules. There's a different set of expectations, and there's a different kind of, I think, DNA about sort of who likes to work there, what kind of work they do. And so in the public sector, being a good steward of tax dollars is a high value, right? So risk aversion, no matter what Clay Christensen says about how the public sector can change, as long as it's accountable for managing that risk of public funds, you're never going to get the kind of experimentation that you get in the private sector, right, where you risk it all. You risk it. Fortunes are lost. Fortunes are won. Nobody gets their name in the newspaper when fortunes are lost, really. Sometimes. Only when public shares are out there, right? But if a private entrepreneur with his own or her own wealth loses all their money, nobody cares. It's not in the newspaper. So this is the part that we're just probably not being honest enough about. The whitewashing around innovation is like, oh, fail fast. It turns out it's actually not quite that simple. So the reason that governments aren't aggressive with this kind of stuff is they really are trying to manage that risk of not getting it right.
What would be a couple of things an average person might be surprised to learn is taking place in Louisville?
Well, I think people might be surprised to learn that we have the only geospatial model of asthma attacks in the world. So we deployed 500 GPS-enabled asthma inhalers to a pretty evenly distributed group of people in our community, and we recorded 8,500 emergency asthma attacks, rescue inhaler attacks, and developed a heat map of where those attacks occur, and it's opened doors in an area that there hasn't been a lot of exploration done for a long time. And so I think people were surprised when they hear that we're working on a crazy problem like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Just using data that you can capture in a relatively simple way, given what's available now.
Yeah, I mean it's a classic example. There was a startup company in Madison, Wisconsin. I got to know when I worked at Health and Human Services, and it's just like, hey, you're relevant to population health. Like they made the technology to help individuals control their asthma, but because it sent signals up to a cloud, you could aggregate the data, right? And you could, if you cared about a place, and I'm a city person, I care about place. You could actually look at that stuff and get a different kind of dividend out of that health technology. It wasn't designed to do that work, but we've used it to help illuminate something that's a significant issue in our community. Asthma and COPD is a big deal here, and that was the only way to get the project done. Great.
I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to me.
Well, thank you so much for suggesting it, and keep doing the great work you're doing. I love all of it.
That's it for this edition of FutureStructure Radio. I'm Chad Vanderveen. Thanks for listening.